The distant rumble of hooves against dry earth was the only warning Pearl Vance had before the dust cloud appeared on the horizon, tearing her attention away from the foreclosure notice clutched in her trembling hands. April 1875 had arrived with cruel determination, stealing not only her husband, but now threatening to take the only home she had left in the unforgiving Wyoming Territory. Pearl pressed a hand to her swollen belly, feeling the baby kick as if protesting the injustice. 5 months pregnant and alone, she watched as the bank representative's carriage disappeared down the path, leaving her with just 3 days to produce a payment she couldn't possibly make. Thomas had been gone barely 2 months, taken by a sudden fever that swept through the territory like wildfire, leaving her with nothing but memories and mounting debts. She turned back toward the modest homestead, 10 acres of land with a small 2-room cabin that Thomas had built with his own hands. The vegetable garden was beginning to sprout, but it wouldn't yield enough to feed her through summer, let alone provide money to save their land. The few chickens they kept wouldn't fetch more than a pittance. "What are we going to do?" she whispered to her unborn child, wiping away a tear before it could fall. At 24, Pearl had never imagined she'd be facing the world alone, especially not with a baby on the way. The next morning, Pearl awoke to the sound of someone calling her name. Pulling a shawl around her shoulders, she stepped onto the porch to find Sheriff Miller dismounting his horse. "Morning, Mrs. Vance," he said, removing his hat. "Just checking in on you. Heard about the foreclosure notice." Pearl nodded, too tired to be surprised that news traveled fast in these parts. 3 days to come up with money I don't have?" Sheriff Miller shifted uncomfortably. "I've known you and Thomas since you first arrived. He was a good man. I wish there was something I could do." "Unless you've got $200 hidden in that hat, Sheriff. I don't think there is." The older man's eyes softened with pity, which Pearl found almost worse than her situation. "The bank's strict on these matters, especially with Harrington running things now." "I know," Pearl said, her voice steady despite her inner turmoil. "I'll figure something out." After the sheriff left, Pearl sat at her kitchen table, mentally cataloging what little she owned. Thomas's pocket watch might fetch $20. Her mother's silver candlesticks another 30, perhaps. She had some jewelry, a simple gold band and a small brooch, but nothing of substantial value. By midday, Pearl had loaded the wagon with everything she could spare. The 14-mile journey to town would take most of the day, but she had no choice. As she climbed onto the bench, a wave of dizziness washed over her. She gripped the seat until it passed, then urged the horse forward. The town of Cottonwood Creek was bustling when Pearl arrived. She pulled up outside the general store, which also served as a trading post. Mr. Harrison, the shopkeeper, offered her far less than she'd hoped for her goods. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Vance, but times are tough all around," he said, pushing $45 across the counter. "This is the best I can do." Pearl bit her lip but accepted the money. It wasn't enough, not nearly enough, but it was something. Her next stop was the jeweler, who gave her $30 for Thomas's watch and her mother's candlesticks. The brooch and wedding ring remained in her pocket. Some sacrifices were too great, even now. As afternoon faded into evening, Pearl had scraped together $97.60, less than half of what she needed. Exhausted and defeated, she sat on a bench outside the Mercantile, wondering where she would go when they took her home. "Mrs. Vance, are you all right?" Pearl looked up to find a tall man standing before her, concern etched across his face. She recognized him as Samuel Tucker, owner of the Double Circle Ranch north of her homestead. She'd seen him around town and at church services, but had never spoken to him directly. "I'm fine, Mr. Tucker, just resting before heading back." Samuel's eyes, a deep shade of green that reminded Pearl of summer pastures, studied her with concern. "It's getting dark. That's quite a journey in your condition." Pearl straightened her shoulders. "I've made it before." "Perhaps, but not when you look ready to collapse from exhaustion." He removed his hat, revealing sandy brown hair. "I heard about your situation with the bank. The whole town's talking." Pearl felt heat rise to her cheeks. The last thing she wanted was to be the object of town gossip, or worse, charity. "I'm handling it," Samuel nodded thoughtfully. I've no doubt. You're Thomas Vance's wife, after all. He always spoke highly of your determination. You knew my husband? Pearl asked, surprised. Not well, but we crossed paths. He was a fair man, honest in his dealings. Samuel paused. I have some business at the bank tomorrow morning. Perhaps we could meet there? I'd like to help if I can. Pearl's pride warred with her desperation. I appreciate the offer, Mr. Tucker, but please, he interrupted gently, at least let me arrange a room for you at the boarding house tonight. The journey home in the dark isn't safe. Too tired to argue, Pearl reluctantly agreed to stay in town. Samuel walked her to the boarding house, paid for her room despite her protests, and promised to meet her at the bank at 9 the next morning. As Pearl lay in the unfamiliar bed that night, she wondered about Samuel Tucker. She'd heard he ran one of the most successful cattle operations in the county, that he was fair to his ranch hands and kept to himself. Widowed like her, though years ago from what she'd heard, with no children. She wondered why someone like him would take an interest in her predicament, but was too exhausted to ponder it for long before sleep claimed her. The next morning, Pearl arrived at the bank precisely at 9, her meager savings clutched in her hand. Samuel was already there, speaking in hushed tones with Mr. Harrington, the bank manager. When he saw her, he smiled and motioned her forward. Mrs. Vance, Harrington greeted her with false warmth. I understand you've come about your overdue payment. Yes, Pearl said, placing her money on the counter. I have $97.60. Harrington's smile faded. As I explained yesterday, the amount due is $200. Without payment in full, I'm afraid. I'd like to settle Mrs. Vance's debt, Samuel interrupted. Pearl turned to him in shock. Mr. Tucker, I couldn't possibly... I'm not offering charity, Mrs. Vance, Samuel said, his voice kind but firm. I've been looking to expand my grazing lands to the south. Your property borders mine. I'd like to purchase the rights to graze my cattle on your land for the next 2 years. Harrington frowned. The land will be foreclosed upon if the debt isn't paid. Then it's fortunate I'm here to ensure that doesn't happen, Samuel replied coolly. He turned to Pearl. I'll pay your debt in full, plus an additional $50. In exchange, my cattle can graze on your land for 2 years. You keep your home and property. All I ask is the right to use the pasture. Pearl hesitated, trying to understand what was being offered. But the pasture is the most valuable part of the property. For cattle, yes, but you'll still have your home, garden, and the woodland area for firewood. After 2 years, the grazing rights revert to you entirely. Samuel's expression was earnest. It's a fair business arrangement, nothing more. Before Pearl could respond, the bank doors swung open and James Bennett, the largest landowner in the county, strode in. His eyes narrowed when he saw Pearl and Samuel. Harrington, Bennett called out, ignoring proper greetings. I trust you remember our discussion about the Vance property. Pearl felt a chill. Bennett had been trying to buy their land for years, offering Thomas insulting sums that her husband had repeatedly refused. Mr. Bennett, Harrington stammered, I was just discussing the matter with Mrs. Vance and Mr. Tucker. Bennett turned his cold gaze to Samuel. Tucker, this doesn't concern you. Actually, it does, Samuel replied calmly. I'm settling Mrs. Vance's debt in exchange for grazing rights. Bennett's face darkened. I've had my eye on that land for 5 years. Harrington and I have an understanding. Any understanding became void the moment I offered to pay Mrs. Vance's debt in full, Samuel said, his voice hardening. Unless you're suggesting the bank would refuse a legitimate payment to honor some backdoor arrangement? Harrington paled under the accusation. Of course not. If Mr. Tucker has the funds. I do, Samuel interrupted, placing a leather pouch on the counter. $200 in banknotes. You can count it. Bennett stepped closer to Pearl, lowering his voice. Think carefully, Mrs. Vance. A woman in your situation needs more than temporary relief. I can offer you a permanent solution, enough money to start fresh somewhere more suitable for a widow with a child. The implication that she couldn't manage on her own made Pearl's blood boil. My home is suitable, Mr. Bennett, and it seems it will remain my home, thanks to Mr. Tucker's fair offer. Bennett's expression hardened. Don't be a fool. Tucker's offering you a reprieve, not a future. That's for Mrs. Vance to decide, Samuel interjected, stepping between them. For a moment, the tension in the room was palpable. Then Bennett laughed, a cold sound without humor. Have it your way, Tucker, but remember cattle die, markets fall, and grazing rights expire. With a final glare, he stormed out. Harrington cleared his throat nervously. Shall we complete the transaction? After signing the necessary papers, Pearl found herself walking alongside Samuel toward the general store, still trying to process what had happened. Why did you do that? She finally asked. Samuel glanced at her. I told you I need the grazing land. There's plenty of available land that doesn't come with my complications, Pearl countered, and Bennett would have paid you to walk away. Samuel stopped walking, turning to face her. Bennett's been trying to buy up every small homestead in the county, pushing families out. I don't much care for his methods. He paused. Besides, my father was a homesteader before he built our ranch. When he died, my mother struggled to keep it going until I was old enough to take over. Someone helped us then. I'm just passing along the favor. Pearl studied his face, searching for signs of ulterior motives, but finding only sincerity. I don't know how to thank you. There's no need. It's a business arrangement that benefits us both. He smiled then, a genuine smile that reached his eyes. Though I wouldn't turn down one of those apple pies you brought to the church social last fall. Best I've ever tasted. Pearl couldn't help but laugh, surprised he remembered something so trivial. That I can manage. After purchasing supplies with some of her remaining money and the extra $50 Samuel had given her, Pearl prepared to return home. Samuel insisted on escorting her, concerned about her traveling alone. As they traveled, Pearl learned more about Samuel Tucker. He'd taken over the double circle when he was just 20, after his father died. Now, at 32, he ran one of the most respected cattle operations in the territory. His wife had died in childbirth 7 years earlier, along with their infant son, a tragedy that had left him focused entirely on his ranch and little else. It must get lonely, Pearl said as they approached her homestead. Samuel was quiet for a moment. I have my hands, my foreman, my horses. Loneliness is a luxury when there's work to be done. Something in his voice told Pearl he was sharing the official answer, not the truth. She understood she'd been giving similar responses about her own grief since Thomas died. As they pulled up to her cabin, Pearl felt a strange reluctance to see him go. Would you like to stay for supper? Is the least I can do. Samuel hesitated, then nodded. I'd like that. Over a simple meal of salt pork, beans, and fresh bread, they talked more easily. Pearl told him about growing up in Missouri, about meeting Thomas at a church picnic, and their decision to head west 4 years ago to claim land under the Homestead Act. Thomas was determined to build something that was truly ours, she explained, her hand instinctively moving to her belly. He would have been so excited about the baby. Samuel's expression softened. He'd be proud of how you're carrying on. I'm not sure about that, Pearl admitted. I nearly lost everything he worked for. You're still here fighting. That's what matters. Samuel hesitated, then added, My cattle will arrive next week. I'll make sure they stay to the north pasture, away from your garden and the house. I appreciate that. After dinner, Samuel helped Pearl bring in water from the well and chop enough firewood to last her several days. As he prepared to leave, he seemed reluctant. If you need anything at all, send word to the double circle, he said. It's not charity, Mrs. Vance. It's being neighborly. Pearl, she corrected him. If we're to be neighbors sharing land, you should call me Pearl. His smile was warm. Pearl. And I'm Samuel. As she watched him ride away, Pearl felt something she hadn't experienced since Thomas fell ill hope. She wasn't alone anymore, at least not entirely. The next week passed quickly as Pearl prepared for the arrival of Samuel's cattle. She reinforced the fence around her garden and cleared the path to the north pasture. When she heard the lowing of cattle and the shouts of cowboys, she stepped onto her porch to watch. Samuel rode at the front, directing his men as they guided about 50 head of cattle into the pasture. When he spotted Pearl, he trotted over. "Everything looks good," he said, dismounting. "We'll keep the herd contained with 2 men watching at all times." "I made something for your cowboys," Pearl said, retrieving a basket of fresh bread and preserved fruits from inside. "The days can get long." Samuel looked surprised and touched by the gesture. "That's mighty kind of you." Over the next few weeks, Pearl grew accustomed to the presence of Samuel's cattle and the 2 cowboys who rotated shifts watching them. Samuel himself appeared every few days, ostensibly to check on the herd, but always finding time to visit with Pearl. He brought supplies from town, sugar, coffee, fabric for baby clothes, insisting they were part of their arrangement when she protested. Sometimes he stayed for meals, and Pearl found herself looking forward to his visits, to their conversations that ranged from books they'd read to memories of places they'd been. One afternoon in late May, Samuel arrived as a sudden storm rolled in. Pearl invited him inside, just as the sky opened, rain pounding against the roof. "Perfect timing," Samuel said, removing his hat and coat. As thunder boomed overhead, Pearl felt a sharp pain lance through her abdomen. She gasped, clutching the back of a chair. "Pearl!" Samuel was at her side instantly, concern etched across his features. "What's wrong?" "I don't know," she admitted as the pain subsided. "It's too early for the baby." But minutes later, another pain gripped her, stronger than before. Samuel's face paled. "You need a doctor." "The doctor's in town," Pearl reminded him, trying to keep her voice steady. 14 miles in this storm. Another contraction hit, and Pearl couldn't hold back a cry of pain. Samuel made his decision quickly. "I'm going for help. Mrs. Peterson's place is only 3 miles from here." Mrs. Peterson, a widow in her 60s who had served as midwife to most of the county's children, was their best hope. Pearl nodded, fear clawing at her throat as Samuel rushed out into the storm. The next hours passed in a blur of pain and fear. Mrs. Peterson arrived, soaked through but efficient, with Samuel hovering anxiously outside the bedroom door. Despite the baby coming nearly 2 months early, Pearl delivered a tiny but healthy girl just before midnight. "She's a fighter," Mrs. Peterson declared, placing the swaddled infant in Pearl's arms. "Small but strong, just like her mama." When Samuel was finally allowed in, Pearl was propped up in bed, her daughter asleep against her chest. The look of wonder on his face as he approached made Pearl's heart skip. "She's beautiful," he whispered, gently touching the baby's tiny hand. "Have you thought of a name?" Pearl nodded. "Hope. Her name is Hope," Samuel smiled. "It suits her." Mrs. Peterson stayed for 2 days, teaching Pearl how to care for her premature daughter and preparing meals that would help her recover her strength. When the older woman finally departed, promising to return in a few days to check on them, Pearl found herself alone with her newborn daughter and terrified. The baby seemed so fragile, her cries sometimes so faint, that Pearl checked constantly to ensure she was still breathing. Sleep became a luxury, as Pearl tended to Hope's needs around the clock. On the 3rd night, exhaustion overwhelmed her. Pearl didn't hear the knock at her door, nor did she hear it open. She awoke to find Samuel standing in her bedroom doorway, concern evident on his face. "I called out, but you didn't answer," he explained apologetically. "I was worried." Pearl tried to sit up, embarrassed to be found in such a state, unwashed, hair tangled, wearing the same nightgown for days. "I'm sorry, I must have fallen asleep." Samuel shook his head. "Don't apologize. You're doing the work of 2 people. He stepped closer, noticing the sleeping infant. "How is she?" "Strong one moment, frighteningly fragile the next," Pearl admitted, tears suddenly welling in her eyes. "I'm so tired I can barely think straight." Without hesitation, Samuel pulled a chair beside the bed. "Sleep. I'll watch over Hope." Pearl started to protest, but exhaustion won out. "Wake me if she cries. She'll need to eat." "I will," he promised. Pearl fell asleep almost immediately. waking hours later to find sunlight streaming through the windows. Panicked, she sat up looking for Hope and found Samuel in the rocking chair by the window, the tiny infant cradled carefully in his large hands. "She's been quiet," he said softly. Opened her eyes a few times to look at me. Relief washed over Pearl. "You stayed all night? You needed rest." He stood, carefully transferring Hope to her mother's arms. "I've asked Mrs. Peterson to come stay for a while. She'll be here later today." Pearl wanted to refuse, to insist she could manage on her own, but the truth was she needed help. "Thank you." Over the next weeks, with Mrs. Peterson's guidance and Samuel's frequent presence, Hope began to thrive. Though still tiny compared to most babies, she gained weight steadily and developed a surprisingly strong grip. Pearl slowly regained her strength as well, returning to her garden and household tasks while balancing the constant care Hope required. Samuel visited almost daily now, often bringing small gifts for Hope: a hand-carved wooden rattle, a soft blanket, a tiny pair of moccasins made by one of his ranch hands' wives. His interest in the baby seemed genuine, his gentleness with her revealing a side of him Pearl suspected few ever saw. One evening in mid-June, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Hope asleep in a cradle Samuel had brought, Pearl found the courage to ask the question that had been on her mind. "Why are you doing all this, Samuel? The debt, the visits, the gifts for Hope. It's far beyond our grazing arrangement." Samuel was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "When Eliza, my wife, died with our son, I thought that was the end of any chance I had at a family. I threw myself into the ranch, built it into something substantial, but at the end of each day, I returned to an empty house." He turned to look at Pearl. "I'm not trying to replace Thomas. I know your heart still belongs to him. But being here, watching you with Hope, it reminds me there's more to life than cattle and land deeds." Pearl was touched by his honesty. "Thomas will always be part of me," but she hesitated, afraid to acknowledge the feelings that had been growing inside her. "My heart isn't as closed as I thought it was." Their eyes met, and something passed between them, an understanding, a possibility. Samuel reached out slowly, taking her hand in his. The simple touch sent warmth through Pearl that had nothing to do with the summer evening. "I should go," he said softly, though he made no move to leave. "Or you could stay for supper," Pearl suggested. "I made stew." He smiled. "I'd like that." As summer progressed into fall, Samuel became a fixture at the Vance homestead. His cattle grazed contentedly in the north pasture, but his true interest was clearly the small family in the cabin. He built a proper crib for Hope, expanded Pearl's garden, and repaired the roof before winter could set in. Pearl found herself looking forward to his visits, to their conversations that stretched late into the evening after Hope was asleep. She learned about his dreams for the double circle, about the books he read during long winter nights, about his hopes to someday build a larger house to replace the cabin his father had built. In turn, she shared her own dreams to see Hope grow strong and healthy, to perhaps plant an orchard next spring, to finish the quilt she'd started before Thomas fell ill. Simple dreams, but ones that seemed more possible with each passing day. The town noticed their growing attachment. When Pearl took Hope to church services, she felt the curious glances, heard the whispers. Some approved of Samuel's interest in the young widow. Others thought it too soon after Thomas's death for her to welcome another man's attention. Pearl tried not to let the gossip bother her, but it was difficult when Mrs. Henderson pointedly mentioned that proper widows mourned for at least a year, or when the butcher's wife asked if she'd already given away Thomas's belongings to make room for new arrangements. Samuel noticed her distress after a particularly difficult trip to town in early October. "People talk because they have little else to occupy their minds," he said as they walked beside the stream that marked the boundary between their properties. Hope was nestled in a sling across Pearl's chest, sleeping peacefully. "Their opinions matter only if you give them power." "It's not just their opinions," Pearl admitted. "Sometimes I feel guilty, as if I'm betraying Thomas by—" She couldn't finish the thought. By feeling happiness again? Samuel supplied gently. Pearl nodded, tears threatening. Samuel stopped walking, turning to face her. Thomas loved you, wanted your happiness. Do you truly believe he would want you to close your heart forever? No, Pearl whispered. He wouldn't. Life is too precious, too uncertain to deny ourselves joy when we find it, Samuel said, his voice low and earnest. I've learned that the hard way. Pearl looked up at him, seeing the emotion in his eyes. Samuel. Before she could continue, hope stirred, letting out a small cry. The moment passed as Pearl soothed her daughter, but something had shifted between them, a recognition of feelings too strong to be ignored much longer. That night, after Samuel had gone home and Hope was asleep, Pearl took out Thomas's photograph from the drawer where she kept his few personal items. She traced his face with her finger, tears sliding down her cheeks. I miss you, she whispered to the image. I'll always miss you, but I think I'm ready to let love in again. I hope you understand. She could almost hear his voice, kind and practical as always. Of course I understand, Pearl. Love isn't meant to die with the one who's gone. The first snow fell in early November, dusting the landscape with white. Samuel arrived at Pearl's cabin looking uncharacteristically nervous, a package tucked under his arm. I have something for you, he said after she invited him in. Hope. Now 5 months old and growing stronger by the day, gurgled happily from her blanket on the floor. Pearl accepted the package, unwrapping it to find a beautiful leather-bound journal. It's lovely, but what's the occasion? Open it, Samuel encouraged. Inside on the first page, Samuel had written in a careful hand, for Pearl and Hope to record the days ahead. May they be filled with joy, laughter, and love. With deepest affection, Samuel. Pearl looked up, touched by the thoughtful gift. Thank you. There's something else I wanted to discuss, Samuel said, his usual confidence giving way to uncertainty. The grazing arrangement has worked well these past months. Yes, it has, Pearl agreed, wondering where this was leading. The thing is, Samuel continued, I find myself coming here not to check on my cattle, but to see you and Hope, to be with you both. Pearl's heart quickened. I enjoy your visits. I'm glad. Samuel took a deep breath. Pearl, I've grown to care for you and Hope deeply, more than I thought possible after losing Eliza. I'm not asking for any promises now, but I wanted you to know my feelings and my hopes for something more between us. When you're ready. Pearl set the journal aside, emotion making it difficult to speak. Samuel, I care for you too. These months, you've brought light back into my life when I thought it would remain dark forever. Hope chose that moment to let out a delighted squeal, breaking the intensity of the moment. Samuel laughed, bending to pick her up. I think someone approves. Pearl smiled, watching him with her daughter. She adores you. The feeling is mutual, Samuel replied, smiling as Hope grabbed at his beard. She's going to be as strong-willed as her mother. Is that a complaint? Pearl asked, raising an eyebrow. On the contrary, Samuel said, his expression growing serious again. It's one of the many things I admire about you both. As winter settled over the territory, Samuel's visits became more purposeful. He brought supplies to ensure Pearl and Hope would be comfortable during the harsh weather, checked that the cabin was properly insulated, and made sure they had plenty of firewood. When a particularly severe blizzard hit in December, he rode through the storm to check on them, arriving half-frozen but determined. Pearl insisted he stay until the weather cleared, setting up a bed for him near the fireplace. For 3 days, they existed in a domestic harmony that felt both new and strangely familiar. Samuel told Hope stories while Pearl cooked. Pearl sang lullabies while Samuel repaired a loose floorboard. They talked late into the night, sharing dreams and fears they'd never voiced to anyone else. When the storm finally passed and Samuel prepared to leave, Pearl felt a profound sense of loss. The cabin would seem empty without his presence, his deep voice, his ready laugh. Standing in the doorway, Samuel paused. I've been thinking about what comes next after winter. Oh? Pearl prompted, hope balanced on her hip. The grazing arrangement was for 2 years, but it seems impractical for me to keep riding back and forth like this. He hesitated, then continued in a rush. I thought perhaps a more permanent arrangement might make sense. For all of us! Pearl's breath caught. What kind of arrangement? Samuel met her gaze steadily. Marriage, Pearl. I'm asking if you would consider becoming my wife. Though she had begun to hope for this, the reality of his proposal still took Pearl by surprise. Samuel, you don't need to answer now, he said quickly. Think about it. Talk to Hope about it. He smiled, gently touching the baby's cheek. I want you both to be sure. After he left, Pearl sat in the rocking chair, Hope sleeping against her chest, and considered Samuel's proposal. Marriage would mean security for herself and Hope, certainly. But it wasn't security that made her heart race when Samuel entered a room, or that caused her to watch the trail for signs of his approach each day. It was love different from what she'd felt for Thomas, but no less real. A love that had grown slowly, built on respect and shared experiences rather than the quick passion of youth. A love that included her daughter, embracing Hope as if she were his own. The next time Samuel visited, a week later, Pearl had her answer ready. But before she could speak, he surprised her with news. Bennett approached me about buying the double circle, he said as they sat at her kitchen table. Offered an impressive sum. Pearl felt a knot of anxiety form in her stomach. Are you considering it? Samuel shook his head. The ranch isn't for sale, but it made me realize something important. He reached across the table, taking her hand. Whatever happens between us, I want to be clear that my proposal isn't about land or combining properties. It's about building a life together. Relief washed over Pearl. I never thought otherwise. Good, he squeezed her hand, because I'd choose you and Hope over all the land in Wyoming Territory. Pearl's eyes filled with tears. In that case, my answer is yes. Samuel's face lit up with joy. Yes? Yes, Pearl confirmed, laughing as he stood and pulled her into his arms. I'll marry you, Samuel Tucker. Their wedding took place on a clear day in early February 1876, a small ceremony in the town church with only a few close friends in attendance. Pearl wore a simple blue dress she had made herself, with Hope, now 8 months old and trying to crawl, dressed in a matching bonnet. The town's reaction was mixed, some offering sincere congratulations, others barely concealing their disapproval of a marriage so soon after Thomas's death. But as Samuel had said, their opinions mattered only if given power, and on this day, Pearl gave them none. After the ceremony, Samuel surprised Pearl by taking her not to his ranch, but back to her homestead. I thought we would be moving to the double circle, Pearl said as they arrived at her cabin, which had been decorated with evergreen boughs and ribbons by Samuel's ranch hands. Eventually, Samuel agreed, helping her down from the wagon. But I thought we might spend our first few months as a family here, where Hope was born, where we first came to know each other. When spring comes, we can decide together where to build our future. Touched by his thoughtfulness, Pearl kissed him their first real kiss as husband and wife. I think that's a wonderful idea. That evening, after settling Hope in her crib, Pearl joined Samuel on the porch. The winter air was crisp but not unbearably cold, the stars brilliant overhead. Are you happy? Samuel asked, his arm around her shoulders. Pearl looked up at him, at the man who had saved her land and then her heart. More than I ever thought I could be again. Good, he murmured, drawing her closer, because I intend to spend the rest of my life making sure you stay that way. As they stood together under the vast Wyoming sky, Pearl thought of the journey that had brought them to this moment of loss and fear, of unexpected kindness and slowly blooming love. She thought of Hope, sleeping peacefully inside, and the future that now stretched before them, full of possibility. A future that had seemed impossible 9 months ago, when a pregnant widow had faced losing everything until a cowboy paid her debt with his cattle and asked nothing in return. Nothing except, eventually, her heart. And as Samuel's lips found hers in the starlight, Pearl knew she had given it freely, completely, with hope for all the days to come. Spring arrived with its promise of renewal, bringing wildflowers to the meadows and new calves to Samuel's herd. Pearl and Samuel had settled into a comfortable routine at the homestead, with plans to move to the double circle once the last of the spring roundup was complete. Hope, now crawling energetically and pulling herself up on furniture, thrived under the loving attention of both Pearl and Samuel. She had begun calling Samuel Da, a development that brought unexpected tears to his eyes the first time he heard it. "She knows," he'd whispered to Pearl that night. "Somehow she knows I love her as my own." "Children have wisdom beyond our understanding," Pearl had replied, squeezing his hand, "and you've been her father in all the ways that matter." As May approached, marking a year since Thomas's death, Pearl visited his grave with fresh flowers. Samuel had offered to accompany her, but she felt this was something she needed to do alone, a final goodbye before fully embracing her new life. Standing before the simple wooden cross, Pearl spoke softly. "I miss you still, Thomas. I always will. But I've found happiness again, with a good man who loves hope as his own." She placed the wildflowers at the base of the cross. "I think you would like him." Returning home, Pearl found Samuel and Hope in the garden. He was showing the baby how to pat soil around a newly planted tomato seedling, his large hands gently guiding her tiny ones. The sight filled Pearl's heart with such love she had to pause, committing the moment to memory. Samuel looked up, spotting her at the edge of the garden. His smile was warm, understanding. "Everything all right?" Pearl nodded, joining them. "Everything is perfect." The following week brought a surprise visitor, James Bennett, riding up to the homestead with two of his men. Samuel was checking cattle in the north pasture, leaving Pearl alone with Hope when the uninvited guests arrived. "Mrs. Tucker," Bennett called, deliberately using her new name with a hint of mockery. "Or do you still prefer Vance?" Pearl stepped onto the porch, holding Hope protectively. "What can I do for you, Mr. Bennett?" Bennett dismounted, approaching the porch with a confidence that made Pearl uneasy. "I've come with a proposition. Tucker's refusal to sell has complicated my plans, but perhaps you might have more sense." "The double circle isn't mine to sell," Pearl replied firmly. "No, but this homestead is at least partly, and it's the key piece I need." Bennett removed his hat, attempting a more personable approach. "I'm prepared to offer you 5 times what this land is worth. More money than you'd see in a lifetime of ranching." Pearl's eyes narrowed. "This land isn't for sale, Mr. Bennett, not at any price." Bennett's cordial demeanor slipped. "Don't be foolish. You have a child to consider. Tucker's ranch is prosperous now, but cattle prices are falling back east. A smart woman would secure her future while she can." "A smart woman knows the difference between threats and advice," Pearl countered, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "Now, I'll thank you to leave my property." Bennett stepped closer, his voice lowering. "This isn't just about land, Mrs. Tucker. Your husband has been interfering with business arrangements throughout the county, encouraging small ranchers to resist selling. It's becoming problematic." Before Pearl could respond, the sound of approaching horses made them both turn. Samuel was riding hard toward the cabin, 2 of his ranch hands following close behind. The look on his face when he saw Bennett standing near Pearl made her shiver. She had never seen him truly angry until now. "Bennett," Samuel called as he dismounted, striding purposefully toward them. "What brings you to my home?" "Just having a friendly conversation with your wife," Bennett replied smoothly, "discussing business opportunities." "Is that so?" Samuel moved to stand beside Pearl, his hand protectively at her back. "And did these opportunities include trying to buy our land behind my back?" Bennett smiled thinly. "I simply thought Mrs. Tucker might be more reasonable than you've proven to be." "Then you don't know my wife very well," Samuel replied, a hint of pride in his voice. "Now I believe she already asked you to leave." For a tense moment, Bennett seemed to consider his options, glancing at Samuel's men who remained mounted, hands casually near their holstered guns. Finally, he nodded. Another time, perhaps. There won't be another time, Samuel said firmly. Our land, all of it, is not for sale. Not today. Not tomorrow. Not ever. I suggest you focus your ambitions elsewhere, Bennett. As Bennett and his men rode away, Pearl let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. He implied you've been causing trouble for him throughout the county. Samuel's expression was grim. Not trouble, just ensuring people know their rights. Bennett's been using questionable tactics to pressure smaller ranchers into selling, threatening to cut off water access, having his men accidentally drive cattle through crops, that sort of thing. Why hasn't the sheriff done anything? Bennett's careful to stay just within the law, and he has friends in high places. Samuel sighed, taking Hope from Pearl's arms and bouncing her gently. But people are starting to stand together against him. That's what really has him worried. That evening, after Hope was asleep, Pearl and Samuel sat at the kitchen table, discussing the confrontation with Bennett and what it might mean for their future. I'm sorry I wasn't here when he arrived, Samuel said, his hand covering Pearl's on the table. The thought of him trying to intimidate you. I can handle James Bennett, Pearl assured him, but I am concerned about his threats. Do you think he might try something more direct? Samuel considered the question carefully. Bennett's ambitious and unscrupulous, but he's not stupid. Direct action against us would turn the entire county against him. He squeezed her hand. Still, I think it might be wise to move to the double circle sooner rather than later. My men are always around, and the main house is more secure. Pearl nodded, having come to the same conclusion. We can be ready in a few days. Most of what matters is Hope's things and a few personal items. Are you sure? Samuel asked, studying her face. This has been your home for 4 years. Home isn't about the building, Pearl said softly. It's about the people we love. You and Hope are my home now, Samuel, wherever we are together. The move to the double circle took place the following week. Pearl was surprised by how emotional she felt leaving the small cabin where she had known both her deepest grief and the beginnings of new joy. But as they arrived at the ranch, with its sprawling main house, bunkhouse, barns, and corrals, she felt a sense of rightness of coming home. The ranch hands welcomed them warmly, particularly delighting in Hope, who seemed to charm everyone she met. Mrs. Gonzalez, the cook who had been with the double circle since Samuel's father's time, immediately took Pearl under her wing, showing her the workings of the much larger kitchen and household. Mr. Samuel has been different since meeting you, the older woman confided, as they prepared dinner on their first evening. Before, he worked from dawn until he could barely stand, then slept only to do it again. Now he smiles, he laughs, he lives. Pearl was touched by the observation. He's brought the same changes to my life. It is as it should be, Mrs. Gonzalez said approvingly, two hearts healing each other. Life at the double circle settled into a pleasant rhythm. Pearl, always an early riser, enjoyed the quiet moments of dawn when she would stand on the porch with a cup of coffee, watching the ranch come to life. Samuel would join her when he could, wrapping his arms around her from behind, his chin resting on top of her head as they contemplated their domain together. Hope took to ranch life with enthusiasm, fascinated by the horses and cattle. By her first birthday in late May, she was taking her first tentative steps, preferring to toddle toward the corral than anywhere else. She's going to be a horsewoman, Samuel predicted proudly, as Hope reached for a gentle mare's nose. Just like her mother, Pearl laughed. I hardly qualify as a horsewoman. Not yet, Samuel agreed with a wink, but I've seen you watching the riders. You want to learn. Pearl couldn't deny it. Is it that obvious? Only to someone who loves you. Samuel lifted Hope onto the saddle of his own horse, holding her securely while she squealed with delight. We'll teach you both. Family tradition at the double circle. Family. The word warmed Pearl's heart. Despite the lingering threat of Bennett's ambitions, despite the challenges of ranching life, despite the occasional whispers in town about their hasty marriage, They were building something beautiful together, a family bound not just by circumstance, but by deep, abiding love. Summer brought the busiest season on the ranch, with Samuel often working from before sunrise until well after sunset. Pearl took on more responsibilities, learning the business side of ranching from Samuel's foreman, Miguel, who had been keeping the books for years. "You have a good head for figures, Mrs. Tucker," Miguel commented one afternoon as they reviewed the accounts. "Better than the boss, if you don't mind my saying." Pearl smiled. "I don't mind at all. And please, call me Pearl." As she became more involved in the ranch operations, Pearl discovered a talent for organization and planning that complemented Samuel's more intuitive approach to ranching. Together, they made decisions about cattle purchases, land use, and market timing that strengthened the Double Circle's position despite the falling prices Bennett had mentioned. In late July, they received news that Bennett had finally overplayed his hand. His attempt to divert water from a creek that served several small ranches had been discovered, leading to formal charges being filed by the territorial court. "It won't stick," Samuel said when Sheriff Miller brought the news. "He has too many friends in high places, but it might make him more cautious for a while." "Or more desperate," the sheriff warned. "Watch yourselves, both of you. Bennett's not the type to take defeat gracefully." The warning proved prescient. 2 weeks later, a fire broke out in one of the Double Circle's hay barns, a fire that investigation revealed had been deliberately set. Though there was no direct evidence linking Bennett to the arson, the timing was suspicious. The incident shook Pearl more than she wanted to admit. That night, after checking on Hope for the third time, she found Samuel on the porch, staring out into the darkness. "I can't prove it was him," Samuel said without turning, "but I know." Pearl joined him, leaning against the railing. "What do we do?" "We could sell the homestead," Samuel suggested reluctantly. "It's what he wants most. With that piece, he controls access to the creek that feeds this whole valley." "No," Pearl said firmly. "That land was Thomas's dream, and now it's part of ours. I won't let Bennett take it through intimidation." Samuel turned to face her, his expression a mixture of pride and concern. "I don't want to put you and Hope in danger." "We're already in danger," Pearl pointed out. "Giving in won't change that. It will only show Bennett that his tactics work." She took Samuel's hands in hers. "We fight, together, for our land, for our future, for the example we want to set for Hope." Samuel studied her face in the moonlight, then nodded slowly. "Together, then." The next day, Samuel called a meeting of neighboring ranchers and farmers, a dozen men whose properties, like the Tuckers, stood in the way of Bennett's expansion plans. They gathered in the Double Circle's main room, their expressions ranging from curiosity to outright skepticism. "I appreciate you coming," Samuel began. "I know some of us have had our differences in the past, but we face a common threat now." "Bennett," said Frank Cooper, whose small cattle operation bordered the Double Circle to the east. Samuel nodded. "He's been picking us off one by one, pressuring those in financial trouble, intimidating others, using whatever leverage he can find." "What do you propose?" asked William Harrison, whose wheat farm had recently suffered mysterious damage to its irrigation system. "An association," Samuel replied. "A formal agreement between all of us to stand together. We pool resources for legal representation, share information about Bennett's activities, and most importantly, agree not to sell our land without consulting the group." The idea sparked intense discussion. Some men were immediately supportive, others cautious about limiting their options, a few openly suspicious of Samuel's motives. "Why should we trust you, Tucker?" demanded George Simmons, who had feuded with Samuel's father years ago over boundary lines. "You're the biggest rancher here after Bennett. How do we know this isn't your way of controlling us?" Pearl stepped forward. "Because we've been where you are." She addressed the group with a confidence that surprised even herself. "Last year, I nearly lost everything to debt. Samuel helped me then, asking nothing in return. Now we're offering the same hand to all of you, not charity, but partnership. Equal standing, equal say, regardless of acreage. Her words shifted the mood in the room. By the end of the meeting, 10 of the 12 landowners had agreed to form the Cottonwood Creek Association, with Samuel elected as president and Pearl as secretary-treasurer. Only Simmons and one other holdout refused to join, though Samuel left the invitation open. As the men departed, several nodded respectfully to Pearl, acknowledging her role in bringing them together. Frank Cooper's wife, Mary, lingered to speak with her privately. "I wanted to thank you," Mary said. "Frank's been worried sick about Bennett's pressure, but too proud to ask for help. This association gives him a way to stand his ground without feeling alone." "That's exactly what we hoped," Pearl replied. "We're stronger together." News of the association spread quickly through the county, eventually reaching Bennett himself. His response came in the form of a letter delivered to the Double Circle by one of his men, an offer to buy both the ranch and the homestead for a sum that made Pearl's eyes widen when she saw the figure. "It's 3 times what the properties are worth," she said as she and Samuel discussed the offer that evening. "He must be desperate." Samuel nodded, tossing the letter onto the fire. "The association has him worried. If he can't break us apart, his whole plan falls apart." "So we stand firm?" "We stand firm," Samuel confirmed, "for Hope's inheritance and for all the families who've put their trust in us." The association's first test came in early September, when George Simmons, one of the 2 who had refused to join, announced he was selling to Bennett. The news was disappointing, but not unexpected. The real challenge would be keeping the other members united, as Bennett inevitably increased pressure. Samuel spent long days riding from ranch to ranch, bolstering resolve, while Pearl managed correspondence with lawyers in Cheyenne who were building cases against Bennett's more questionable activities. Hope, now 16 months old and talking in simple sentences, became the Double Circle's unofficial mascot, accompanying Pearl to association meetings where her cheerful presence reminded everyone what they were fighting for the future. As autumn approached, bringing with it the cattle drive season, a new worry emerged. The association had successfully blocked Bennett's expansion plans on land, but he controlled much of the local cattle shipping business through investments in the railroad spur line. There were rumors he might refuse access to association members or charge exorbitant rates. "We need an alternative," Samuel told Pearl as they reviewed their options. "If we can't ship through Bennett's connections, we need our own route to market." Pearl studied the map spread across the table. "What about driving the herds further north to the main line? It's longer, but Bennett has no influence there." "It's possible," Samuel agreed, tracing the route with his finger. "But it means crossing the high country just as winter weather could set in. Risky." "Less risky than letting Bennett control our livelihoods," Pearl pointed out. After consulting with the other ranchers, a decision was made they would combine their herds for a massive drive to the northern railhead, setting out in early October with their best cowboys and strongest cattle. Samuel would lead the drive personally, expecting to be gone for at least 3 weeks if all went well. The night before his departure, Samuel held Pearl close, both of them aware of the dangers ahead. "If anything happens," he began. Pearl pressed her fingers to his lips. "Don't. You'll come back to us. You promised Hope you'd teach her to ride when you return." Samuel smiled despite his worry. "So I did. And I never break promises to my girls." The following morning, Pearl stood with Hope in her arms, watching as the combined herds moved out, nearly 2,000 head of cattle with 20 riders guiding them north. Samuel rode back briefly for one final goodbye, leaning down from his saddle to kiss first Hope's forehead, then Pearl's lips. 3 weeks, he promised. 4 at the most. Pearl nodded, forcing a smile. "We'll be waiting." The days after Samuel's departure passed slowly. Pearl kept busy with ranch operations and association business, grateful for the support of Miguel and Mrs. Gonzalez, who treated Hope as their own grandchild. Each night, she would show Hope the stars, pointing to the north. "That's where Papa is," she would say. "He's thinking of us right now, just as we're thinking of him." 2 weeks into the cattle drive, a rider from another ranch returned with news the drive had reached the halfway point successfully, though a day behind schedule due to a river crossing made difficult by early rains. Relief washed over Pearl. They were making progress, but that relief was short-lived. 3 days later, Bennett appeared at the double circle, unannounced and unwelcome. "Mrs. Tucker," he greeted her with false cordiality as she met him on the porch, Miguel standing protectively nearby. "I thought we might continue our conversation from last spring without your husband's passionate interruptions." "I have nothing to say to you that hasn't already been said," Pearl replied coolly. "Our land is not for sale." Bennett's smile tightened. "I admire your loyalty, but circumstances have changed. Your husband's cattle drive is heading into dangerous territory. Early snow in the high passes, bandits known to operate in the region." He shrugged. Ranching is such a risky business. The implied threat made Pearl's blood run cold, but she kept her expression neutral. "If you've come to threaten my family, Mr. Bennett, you've wasted your time. Samuel will return safely, and the association will continue to stand against your tactics." "The association," Bennett scoffed, "a desperate alliance of failing operations led by a man who cares more for principle than pragmatism." He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Simmons sold to me. Harrison will follow soon. The others will fall in line once they see the pattern. Why risk being on the losing side?" Pearl held her ground. "Because some things matter more than winning or losing, Mr. Bennett, like honor, community, and the world we're building for our children." Bennett studied her for a moment, then laughed a cold, dismissive sound. "Your husband has made you an idealist, Mrs. Tucker. A dangerous luxury in this territory." He turned to leave, then paused. "My offer remains open until the first snow falls. After that, circumstances may force me to reconsider the terms." After Bennett departed, Pearl found herself shaking with a mixture of fear and anger. His veiled threats against Samuel and the cattle drive couldn't be ignored, but there was no way to warn her husband the drive had progressed beyond the reach of any messenger she could send. That night, Pearl made a decision. The next morning she asked Miguel to summon an emergency meeting of the association members who had remained behind. "Bennett came to threaten me yesterday," she told the assembled ranchers and farmers. "He implied he might take action against the cattle drive." Murmurs of concern rippled through the group. "What can we do?" asked Mary Cooper, whose husband was with Samuel. "They're too far to warn." "We send reinforcements," Pearl stated firmly. "A second party of riders, traveling light and fast, can catch up to the drive before they reach the high passes." "Who would go?" William Harrison asked. "Most of our best men are already with the drive." "I will," said a voice from the doorway. Everyone turned to see George Simmons, who had supposedly sold to Bennett. "I never actually signed the papers," he explained. "Just let Bennett think I had to see what he'd do next." Relief and welcome greeted this revelation. Simmons wasn't alone. He had brought 4 experienced riders willing to set out immediately. Plans were quickly made, supplies gathered, and by noon, the reinforcement party was ready to depart. Pearl watched them ride out, offering a silent prayer for their safe journey and for Samuel's protection. Hope, sensing her mother's tension, was unusually clingy that day, refusing to leave Pearl's side even for naps. "It's all right, sweetheart," Pearl soothed, stroking her daughter's hair as they rocked in the chair Samuel had made for them. "Papa will be home soon." The wait that followed was agonizing. Each day brought new worries as weather reports indicated an early winter system moving toward the high country. Pearl threw herself into work, spending long hours going over the ranch books, planning improvements for the spring, anything to keep her mind occupied. On the night of the 20th day since Samuel's departure, the day he had estimated for their arrival at the railhead, if all went well, the first snow of the season fell on the double circle. Pearl stood at the window, watching the flakes swirl in the lamplight, remembering Bennett's deadline. "Come home," she whispered into the darkness. "Please come home." 2 more days passed with no word. Pearl maintained a brave face for Hope in the ranch hands, but inside, fear gnawed at her constantly. On the morning of the 23rd day, Miguel rushed into the house, his expression urgent. "Riders coming," he announced. "Many riders." Pearl's heart leapt to her throat as she hurried outside, lifting Hope into her arms. In the distance, a group of horsemen approached through the light snow that continued to fall. Too few to be the entire drive crew, but more than just messengers. As they drew closer, Pearl strained to see if Samuel was among them. For a terrible moment, she couldn't find him, and then she saw him, riding slightly apart from the others, his posture unmistakable even at a distance. "Papa!" Hope called out, spotting him at the same moment. "Papa home!" Pearl set Hope down on the porch and ran, heedless of the cold or the snow or anything except the need to reach her husband. Samuel saw her coming and urged his horse forward, dismounting in a fluid motion to catch her in his arms. "You're back," she breathed, clinging to him. "You're really back." "I promised," Samuel replied, his voice rough with emotion, though it was a closer thing than I would have liked. Only then did Pearl notice the bandage on his arm and the exhaustion in his face. "What happened?" "Bennett's men ambushed us in the narrow pass, trying to scatter the herd," Samuel explained, keeping his arm around her as they walked back toward the house where Hope was bouncing with excitement. "We might have lost everything if Simmons and his riders hadn't arrived when they did." "You're hurt," Pearl said, touching the bandage gently. "It's nothing, just a graze," Samuel assured her. "Others weren't as fortunate. We lost Jenkins and Rodriguez in the fighting." Pearl's heart sank at the news of the two ranch hands, good men with families. "And the cattle?" "Most made it through. We completed the sale at the railhead yesterday full price, despite Bennett's attempts to telegraph ahead and undermine us." Samuel's expression turned grim. "The territorial marshal is involved now. The ambush was too blatant, too violent for Bennett to explain away." They reached the porch, where Hope launched herself into Samuel's arms with a squeal of delight. He winced slightly as he caught her, but his smile was radiant as he lifted her high. "There's my big girl," he exclaimed. "Have you been taking care of Mama while I was gone?" Hope nodded solemnly. "I help. Mama's sad, but I help." Samuel's eyes met Pearl's over their daughter's head. "Mama was sad because she missed Papa," he explained. "But Papa's home now, and he's not going away again for a very long time." That evening, after Hope was asleep and the returning men had been fed and tended to, Pearl and Samuel sat before the fire in their bedroom, the weight of the past weeks finally settling upon them. "When Bennett came here," Pearl began, curled against Samuel's side, "he threatened you, implied he would do something to the cattle drive. I was so afraid." "But you didn't give in," Samuel finished, his fingers combing gently through her hair. "You organized reinforcements instead." Pearl looked up at him. "How could I do anything else? This land, this life we're building, it's worth fighting for." "Yes, it is," Samuel agreed softly. "And so are you. Do you know what kept me going during that ambush, when bullets were flying and men were falling? The thought of you and Hope waiting for me? The home we've made together." "We're still waiting," Pearl whispered, reaching up to touch his face. "Always." In the months that followed, life at the Double Circle gradually returned to normal. Bennett was indicted by the territorial court for his role in the ambush, though his political connections ensured he received only a fine rather than imprisonment. Still, his reputation was irrevocably damaged, and many of his business associates distanced themselves from his ventures. The Cottonwood Creek Association grew stronger, eventually establishing its own shipping cooperative that bypassed Bennett's control of the local railroad spur. Samuel continued as president, with Pearl taking an increasingly active role in strategic planning. By the time Hope's second birthday arrived in May 1877, the shadow of Bennett's threats had receded, replaced by the bright promise of the future. The celebration was held at the Double Circle, with association members and their families gathering to mark not just Hope's birthday, but the community they had built together. As Pearl watched Samuel leading Hope on her first pony ride, a gentle old mare named Buttercup, She felt a profound sense of gratitude for the journey that had brought them to this moment. From the depths of despair when Thomas died and she faced losing her land, to the unexpected kindness of a cowboy who asked nothing in return, to the love that had grown between them, strong enough to withstand threats and violence and uncertainty. Samuel caught her watching and smiled, that special smile reserved just for her. Later, as the guests departed and the ranch settled into evening quiet, he found her on the porch, gazing at the sunset. "Penny for your thoughts," he said, wrapping his arms around her from behind. Pearl leaned into his embrace. "I was thinking about that day when the bank representative came with the foreclosure notice, how certain I was that it was the end of everything. And now? Now I know it was just the beginning." She turned in his arms to face him. "I have something to tell you." Samuel's expression grew curious. "What is it?" Pearl took his hand and placed it on her stomach, watching understanding dawn in his eyes. "Hope is going to have a brother or sister come winter." Joy spread across Samuel's face, followed quickly by concern. "Are you feeling well? Do you need to rest more? I can take over the books for a while, and Mrs. Gonzalez can—" Pearl laughed, pressing a finger to his lips. "I'm perfectly fine. We both are." Samuel pulled her close, his embrace gentle as if she might break. "I love you, Pearl Tucker, more than I have words to express." "Then show me," Pearl whispered against his lips. "We have a lifetime for you to show me." And in the glow of the setting sun, as hope slept peacefully inside and new life grew within her, Pearl knew with absolute certainty that love, like the land they cherished, could endure all seasons through loss and renewal, hardship and joy, always finding its way home.